Well, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. says the rivalry between China and the United States is constraining choices, exacerbating flashpoints, and creating new security dilemmas for Southeast Asian nations. He gave the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where he stressed the role of ASEAN amid big power competition.
The region looks to ASEAN as the institution that will hold the center amidst these evolving dynamics. Yet challenges threaten our unity and our centrality.
On a question regarding recent tensions in the South China Sea, President Marcos warns that should there be any Filipino deaths resulting from that, it would be as close to what his country would consider an act of war.
We already have suffered injury, but thank God we have not yet gotten to the point where any of our participants, civilian or otherwise, have been killed. But once we get to that point, that is certainly, we would have crossed the Rubicon, certainly crossed the Rubicon. Is that a red line? Almost certainly it's going to be a red line.
And for more analysis, we're joined by Associate Professor Eduardo Araral. He's from the NUS Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Professor, we just heard that wasn't a question and answer session in which President Marcos had to spell out what would be the crossing of a red line and therefore the needing to trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States as far as activity in the South China Sea goes. Now, a great deal of that speech was stressing of Filipino adherence, commitment to the international rules-based global order. Was there anything else apart from that stood out for you?
Well, thank you for having me. The reference of the president to the red line is not really automatically trigger the mutual defense treaty. That is probably a colloquial way of saying for him that he doesn't want any casualties on the side of the Philippines because it would make it politically difficult for him to defend the United States and to have any more space to deal with China. Because the mutual defense treaty really has mechanisms to de-escalate the conflict once it happens. So even if hypothetically that a Filipino dies as a result of this conflict with China, the Mutual Defense Treaty Article 4 says that in cases like this, the issue will be brought forth to the Congress of the United States and to the UN Security Council, and it will be discussed there. So there's no automatic trigger mechanism. There's a mechanism for dialogue and de-escalation. And I don't think the United States would get into the fray with China simply because a Filipino died, hypothetically, in this situation. So President Marcos' reference of Filipino dying would trigger the MDT is more of a hyperbole than what would actually happen in the Mutual Defense Treaty.
All right. If, as you say, it is a hyperbole from the Philippine president, nevertheless, on a platform such as the Shangri-La Dialogue, it is hyperbole that people would take seriously. For example, Philippines is a founding member of ASEAN. ASEAN, like it or not, would be drawn into any potential conflict in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, as Mr. Marcos calls it. How would ASEAN, for example, a speech like that, how much does it include ASEAN centrality in terms of subscribing to this particular position for the Philippines?
I'm glad that he made references to ASEAN centrality, because that really should be the case, that he felt that the Philippines must be lonely in its position with China because most of the ASEAN countries, some ASEAN countries have no territorial claims, and others, while they have disputes with China, they have managed it differently, and because they have long-standing commercial, economic, and other ties with China, so they deal with it differently. The case of the Philippines is special because the Philippines is a mutual defense treaty ally of the United States, and it's next door to China, and it's next door to Taiwan, and the Philippines hosts American bases. So the Philippines really stands out differently compared to other ASEAN members. ASEAN members can call for acceleration of the code of conduct. I think that would be a good outcome, so that the threats and crisis communication or unwarranted incidents in the South China Sea could be averted. But of course, it's only about crisis management. We're not yet getting to the bottom of the issue, which is about maritime and territorial conflict between China and the United States. And as you correctly pointed out, the involvement or the entanglement of the United States makes things complicated, because this is not just between the Philippines and China, because the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, and the United States has a stake also in Taiwan, and their bases are very close to Taiwan. So whatever happens to Taiwan, the Philippines would be dragged onto this conflict. So it's not a simple maritime dispute between the Philippines and China, but this is a very complicated historical, geopolitical, and regional
Indeed, as
issue.
you mentioned, the president said the U.S.-China contestation permeates everything, certainly in this region. And as you say, this rivalry, where does ASEAN centrality stand if, as you mentioned, different countries are either treaty allies or non-aligned or close partners without being treaty allies with the United States? Wherein ASEAN centrality?
Well, ASEAN central is central in terms of ASEAN has a big stake in terms of peace and order in the region. All the ASEAN countries trade with China, and they also have ties with the United States in terms of economic ties, defense ties, and other ties. So all of the countries in Southeast Asia would probably say they don't want any conflict between the U.S. and China, because nobody wants to be asked which side are they on if a conflict breaks out. That's why ASEAN should gather together as one. But as President Marcos must have felt, that he felt lonely, that he's the only one among ASEAN member countries who's vigorously standing up against China. Again, it's a historical issue, and the Philippines needs to talk to ASEAN and not just to the United States. Otherwise, the Philippines looks like it's just a pawn of the United States against China, which other critics of President Marcos is saying. So his message at the Shangri-La Dialogue is good, that he recognized the importance of ASEAN centrality, and because nobody wants ASEAN to be sidelined in this very important issue.
Oh, thanks so much for that. Associate Professor Eduardo Araral from the NUS Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.